Waitress sees her mother's photo in a billionaire's wallet. His secret changes everything. What happens when a struggling waitress finds an old photograph in a billionaire's wallet and realizes it's a picture of her mother? What happens when a simple question, "Where did you get this?" unravels a secret that was never meant to be hidden? And what happens when she learns the truth, that the man sitting before her isn't just any wealthy stranger, he's the father she never knew existed? Lena Voss had spent her whole life believing she was alone. Her mother, Lillian, had passed away years ago, leaving her with nothing but memories and an empty apartment she could barely afford. No family, no past, no one to turn to. But all of that changed in an instant, because one glance at an old, worn photograph, her mother's face frozen in time, was all it took for her entire world to come crumbling down. And the man who held that photograph? He had been searching for her mother for years, and now he had found her instead. Lena had spent years believing her story had already been written. A girl with no family, no safety net, no one to fall back on. She had convinced herself that life would always be an uphill battle, one where she had to fight for every inch, where nothing came easy, where she was utterly alone. But fate had other plans. Because in that moment, as she stood frozen in that small diner, staring at a man who should have been a stranger, but wasn't, her life was about to take a turn she never saw coming. She had spent so long struggling to survive, never daring to hope for anything more. But now she was about to step into a world completely different from the one she had always known. A world of wealth, power, and influence. A world where people didn't live paycheck to paycheck, where the future wasn't dictated by survival, and where opportunities weren't just dreams, they were expectations. For the first time, Lena wasn't just another nameless waitress scraping by. She was someone with a story, someone with a past that was bigger than she ever imagined. Because Richard Langford wasn't just some billionaire, he was connected to her in a way that changed everything. And now she had to decide what that meant. Would she walk away, pretending this never happened, returning to the life she had always known? Or would she step forward, into the unknown, into a world where she was no longer invisible, no longer just a girl who had been left behind by fate? One thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And what came next would transform her life forever. Would she accept the truth? Would she walk away from everything she had ever known? Or would she finally embrace the one thing she had always longed for, but never dared to believe she could have? A family. Stay with us, because this story is just beginning. Lena Voss had never known what it was like to have a real family. No father, no siblings, no warm holiday gatherings filled with laughter, no childhood home with faded pencil marks on the wall to measure her height year after year. For most of her life, it had just been her and her mother, Lillian. And for the longest time, that had been enough. Lillian Voss was not just Lena's mother, she was her entire world. She was the one who made everything feel safe, no matter how uncertain their future seemed. The one who could turn a run-down apartment into a home with nothing but a few thrifted blankets and the scent of freshly baked bread. She worked tirelessly, balancing multiple jobs, sacrificing sleep just to make sure Lena never went hungry. But despite the exhaustion that lined her face, she always smiled. Lena could still hear her laughter, light and warm, like sunshine after a storm. Her mother had a way of making even the hardest days feel bearable. She would hum as she cooked, tell stories as she brushed Lena's hair, and whisper words of encouragement on nights when Lena felt like the world was just too big, too overwhelming. "You and me, sweetheart, we'll always find a way." It was a promise, one Lena had clung to, believing it would never break. But promises don't stop fate. Lillian had been strong, until she wasn't. It started with exhaustion, then came the cough, then the nights spent curled up on the couch, too tired to move. Lena, barely 14, had noticed, had begged her to see a doctor, but medical bills weren't something they could afford, and Lillian had waved away her concerns with a reassuring smile. "I'm just tired, honey, that's all." It wasn't just tiredness. By the time Lillian was finally admitted to the hospital, the doctors said there was nothing they could do. The illness had already taken too much from her, stealing her strength, her breath, her future. Lena sat by her bedside every single day, refusing to leave, refusing to accept what was coming. She held her mother's hand, pressing it against her cheek, willing her to stay. "Mom, please, you promised it would be us against the world." Lillian had only smiled, a weak, tired smile that broke Lena's heart. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, sweetheart. And you're going to be okay." Lena had shaken her head, eyes burning with unshed tears. No, I won't be okay. I can't be okay without you." Her mother's fingers had tightened around hers. Just once, just long enough to make Lena believe, for the briefest second, that she could still fight this. "I love you," Lillian had whispered. And then, silence. No more warmth in her fingers, no more tired smiles, no more lullabies in the middle of the night. Lena had screamed for a nurse, but deep down, she already knew. Her mother, the only person who had ever truly loved her, the only family she had ever known, was gone. And just like that, Lena was alone. She had no one after that. There were no aunts, no uncles, no long-lost family members to take her in. Just social workers, foster homes, and a system that saw her as another case file to process. She learned quickly that the world wouldn't stop for her grief. By the time Lena turned 18, she was on her own. No savings, no support, just a small bag of clothes and a lifetime of loneliness. She had spent the last 4 years fighting to survive, but the battle had started long before that. School had never been easy for Lena, but not because of academics. In fact, she was one of the best students in her class, sharp, hardworking, and determined. No matter how many part-time jobs she had to juggle, no matter how many nights she stayed up studying under a dim kitchen light while her mother worked late shifts, she never let her grades slip. Education was the one thing she could control, the one thing she could use to build a future beyond the struggles that had defined her life. But being poor in a school full of kids who had more than they would ever need, that was something she couldn't control. The other students didn't just notice that she was different, they made sure she felt it every single day. Lena's clothes were always secondhand, worn a little too thin, a little too tight, or a little too loose, because she had to make them last. Her shoes were scuffed, her backpack had frayed straps, and while the other kids carried brand new notebooks and expensive pens, she used whatever she could salvage from last year's supplies. She never complained, she never asked for pity, but that didn't stop the whispers. Is she wearing that same sweater again? No wonder she always studies, she has nothing else to do. Maybe if she wasn't so poor, she wouldn't be so uptight. Lena heard it all, but she never let it break her. She refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, she pushed herself harder. If she couldn't control the way people saw her, she could control the way she proved them wrong. She aced every test, delivered every project with precision, and made sure that no matter how much they mocked her for what she lacked, they could never deny what she had: intelligence, drive, and the will to be better. Teachers praised her. Some even encouraged her to apply for scholarships, to chase something bigger. But her classmates, they only saw it as another reason to bring her down. Look at her, acting like she's better than everyone. She thinks good grades will make her less pathetic. She's so desperate to be noticed, it's actually sad. The worst part? They weren't wrong about one thing. She was desperate to escape, to build a life where she didn't have to prove her worth to people who would never care. But then she lost her mother, and suddenly school didn't matter as much. Not when she had bigger problems, like figuring out where her next meal would come from, how she was going to keep a roof over her head, and whether she could survive on her own. The moment she turned 18, there was no one left to catch her. No college fund, no guidance counselor checking in, no relatives to take her in. She was officially an adult, and that meant the world had stopped caring. So, Lena did what she had always done. She fought. She took any job she could find: waitressing, cleaning, stocking shelves at a grocery store. She worked late, woke up early, and saved every dollar she could. Some nights she went to bed hungry because rent mattered more than food. Some days she wondered if all this effort would ever lead to something better. But she refused to give up. She had lost everything, but she still had herself. And as long as she had that, she would survive. Now, at 21, she lived in a cramped apartment over a laundromat, where the rent was just low enough for her to afford on her wages from Grady's diner. The place was small, the pipes rattled, and the heater only worked when it felt like it, but it was hers. Hers alone. Most nights, she fell asleep listening to the hum of washing machines below her. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that the world kept moving, even when she felt stuck. Lena never complained. She couldn't afford to. She had no family, no safety net, no one to fall back on. She only had herself. And she had spent her whole life believing that was all she would ever have. But in the next few moments, that belief would be shattered. Because family wasn't as far away as she thought. The morning had started like any other. Lena had woken up before sunrise, the faint hum of washing machines from the laundromat below her apartment acting as her unofficial alarm. She had thrown on her usual uniform, a plain white blouse, black skirt, and an apron that had seen better days, before making the short walk to Grady's diner. The diner was nothing fancy, just a small place tucked between a gas station and a hardware store, the kind of spot where truck drivers and locals came for greasy breakfasts and bottomless coffee. The air smelled of bacon grease and maple syrup. The floors were slightly sticky no matter how many times they were mopped. The radio played an old country song that crackled through the speakers. Lena didn't mind. It was a job, it paid her rent, and most of the time, it was predictable. She had taken orders, refilled coffee, smiled at customers who barely noticed her presence. Just another waitress, just another day. Until he walked in. She had noticed him immediately. It was impossible not to. While the usual crowd consisted of tired truckers, old couples, and construction workers, this man was different. He stepped inside like he didn't belong here, because he didn't. His suit was tailored, expensive, not the kind you wore to a small-town diner. His watch gleamed under the dull lighting, and when he glanced at the menu, it was with the detached air of someone who never had to worry about a meal in his life. Lena had heard his name before. Richard Langford. It was a name that carried weight, spoken in financial circles with admiration and sometimes envy, the kind of name that appeared in glossy business magazines, accompanied by headlines about record-breaking deals and billion-dollar ventures. Even in Briar Ridge, a town where wealth felt like a distant concept, people knew of him. He wasn't just rich, he was powerful. Richard Langford was the founder and CEO of Langford Enterprises, a conglomerate that stretched its reach across multiple industries: real estate, finance, technology, and even luxury goods. The kind of empire that made him more than just a wealthy man. It made him untouchable. He built skyscrapers in cities she'd only seen in pictures, owned hotels that catered to the elite, and had an investment portfolio so vast it could probably fund Briar Ridge 100 times over. His influence wasn't just in money, it was in power, in the connections he held, in the decisions he made that could shift markets and reshape entire industries. But what was someone like him doing here? This wasn't a high-rise boardroom or an exclusive gala. This was a roadside diner. A place where truckers grabbed coffee before long hauls, where locals came for a slice of pie and a bit of conversation, where Lena spent her days refilling cups and taking orders just to make ends meet. Men like Richard Langford didn't just show up in places like this. And yet there he was, seated at table 5, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed out of place against the worn-out vinyl booths and checkered floors. His presence felt almost surreal, like a character from another world who had accidentally stepped into hers. Lena tried to make sense of it. Maybe he was passing through on business. Maybe he was meeting someone. Maybe, for once, a man who had everything just wanted something simple, something real. Whatever the reason, he didn't belong here. And yet, in a way neither of them could have expected, he did. She didn't know what someone like him was doing in a place like this. And frankly, she didn't care. Rich or poor, a customer was a customer, and right now, all he was to her was table 5. The lunch rush had come and gone, leaving the diner in a lull of soft chatter and clinking silverware. Lena wiped her hands on her apron as she approached table 5, where the newest customer sat. A man who didn't belong in a place like this. Richard Langford. She had recognized him the moment he walked in. He had the kind of presence that turned heads, the kind of aura that made people step aside without knowing why. He wasn't just another businessman, he was the businessman. The type who built skyscrapers, signed deals worth millions, and had his name printed in glossy magazines beside the word powerhouse. And yet, here he was, sitting in a worn leather booth, sticking out like a diamond in a pile of loose change. Unlike most high-profile men, he wasn't surrounded by bodyguards or assistants. He hadn't even glanced at his phone, the way wealthy men always did, as if the world would collapse if they weren't checking their emails every 5 seconds. Instead, he simply sat there, flipping through the laminated menu, completely at ease. But Lena could tell he wasn't just here for the food. There was something else behind those sharp, observant eyes. When she approached, he looked up, giving her his full attention. Not dismissively, not like she was just another nameless waitress in the background, but like he actually saw her. She was used to people brushing her off, treating her like she barely existed. This was different. "What can I get for you?" she asked, keeping her voice polite but neutral. He studied the menu for another second before closing it. "The special, and coffee, black." His voice was smooth, deep, but there was something behind it. Something heavy. Lena nodded, jotting it down. She had no reason to think twice about this man. Just another customer. Just another order. She left to grab his coffee, and when she came back, she saw it. The wallet, but what was inside it? A few bills, a business card, maybe something ordinary, something unimportant? Or was it something much more? Something that had been waiting for years to be found. Something that would change everything. Want to know what happens next? Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Because sometimes the smallest discoveries hold the biggest secrets. And this was a secret that would rewrite her entire life. It was open on the table, revealing a worn, creased photograph tucked behind his credit cards. And Lena's world stopped. She had seen that photo before. The exact same image sat inside her nightstand, a keepsake from a life she had lost. Her mother. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. The dining noise faded, the clatter of dishes and low hum of conversations dulling into nothingness. Her grip tightened around the coffee pot. What was her mother's picture doing in this man's wallet? 100 thoughts raced through her mind. Who was he to her mother? How did he have this photo? Was this just a coincidence? Her pulse pounded in her ears as she forced herself to speak. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice was steady, but inside she was unraveling. "That photo in your wallet, where did you get it?" The moment the words left her lips, the air seemed to shift. The diner, once filled with the soft murmur of conversations and the clinking of silverware, felt eerily silent. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe the noise was still there, but Lena couldn't hear it anymore. Because all she could focus on, all that mattered, was the man sitting in front of her and the photograph in his hands. Her heart pounded so loudly she swore he could hear it. She wasn't even breathing. Had she really just said that? Had she really asked? She wasn't ready for the answer. She knew she wasn't ready for the answer. Because if she was right, if this was real, then everything she thought she knew about her life was about to change. But there was no taking it back now. The words were out in the open, and as Richard Langford's sharp gaze met hers, something flickered in his expression. Surprise, confusion, and then something deeper, something dangerous. Lena's stomach twisted. The seconds stretched impossibly long, the space between them tightening, suffocating. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, she was afraid of the truth. Richard Langford looked up sharply. His relaxed expression vanished, replaced by something unreadable. His fingers instinctively closed around the wallet, but not before his gaze flickered back to the photo, as if he hadn't expected anyone to notice it. "Why do you ask?" His voice was quiet, cautious. Lena's stomach churned. Because this wasn't just some old photograph. It wasn't just some stranger's picture. She swallowed hard. "Because that's my mother." Silence. The air shifted. The clinking of silverware, the murmur of other customers, it all became background noise, insignificant compared to the weight of what had just been said. Richard Langford stared at her like she had spoken the impossible, like she had just said something that couldn't be true. And then, barely above a whisper, he asked the question that sent shivers down her spine. "What's your mother's name?" Lena's throat was dry, but she forced herself to answer. "Lillian Voss." Richard's breath caught. The world around him blurred, the hum of the diner fading into nothing but white noise. Lillian Voss. It was a name he hadn't spoken in years, hadn't allowed himself to. Yet hearing it now, from the lips of a girl who shouldn't exist, felt like a punch to the gut. His fingers tightened around his wallet, knuckles white. He didn't even realize he was holding his breath. How was this possible? His mind reeled, unraveling years of memories all at once. Lillian's laughter, soft and full of life. The way she'd look at him, her eyes bright with mischief whenever she challenged him to do something reckless. The stolen moments, the whispered promises, the dreams they had built together, only for them to be shattered by forces beyond their control. Richard had spent his whole life haunted by the past, by the what-ifs, by the love he had lost. He had searched for her, fought against the impossible odds his father had stacked against them, but when he finally got close, she was already gone. And now he was staring at proof that everything he thought he knew had been a lie. She had a daughter. Their daughter. A lifetime of longing, of wondering, of mourning something he thought was lost forever. And all this time, a piece of Lillian had been here, walking this earth, growing up without him. He swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. Lena. He looked at her now, really looked at her, and the resemblance hit him like a tidal wave. The shape of her face, the sharp determination in her eyes, the way she stood, guarded, but with an undercurrent of strength. She wasn't just anyone. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just some stranger. This man, this billionaire sitting in a diner, gripping an old photograph like it held the key to his past, was connected to her in a way she never imagined. Richard exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "Lillian Voss," he repeated, almost like he didn't believe it, like the name alone carried too much weight, too much history, too much pain. Lena's pulse pounded. "You knew her, didn't you?" His lips parted, but for a moment, no words came. A flicker of something raw passed through his eyes. Grief, regret, something deeper than she could name. Then, finally, he spoke. "I didn't just know her, Lena." His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "I loved her." Lena's heart clenched. This man, this wealthy, powerful man who had probably never gone a day without luxury, had loved her mother? It didn't make sense. Lillian Voss had lived her whole life struggling to make ends meet. There had never been talk of some great love, of a man who had once meant everything to her. There had only been survival, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of a woman who had raised her daughter alone. She shook her head, trying to make sense of it. "Then why?" Her voice wavered. "Why did she never mention you?" Richard let out a bitter chuckle. "Because she never got the chance." His expression darkened, his eyes clouding with memories that had long been buried. "My family, my father, made sure of that." Lena felt a chill crawl up her spine. Richard's father, the patriarch of the Langford Empire, a man who had built his wealth on ruthless business decisions and an iron grip over his family's future. She had heard the name before. Henry Langford. A man who controlled more than just businesses. He controlled people. And once upon a time, he had controlled Richard's fate. Richard's fingers tightened around his wallet, as if holding on to the past itself. I met Lillian when I was 22. She was the most incredible person I had ever known. His voice softened, like he was seeing her in his mind, the way she used to smile, the way she used to laugh. She was kind, brilliant, full of life. She made me feel human, like I was more than just a Langford, more than just my father's son. He exhaled, shaking his head. I wanted to marry her. Lena's breath caught. Marry? This wasn't just some fleeting romance. This wasn't just a rich man playing with the idea of love. Her mother had been everything to him. But my father found out. Richard's voice hardened, his jaw clenching. And, in his eyes, she wasn't good enough. She wasn't the right kind of woman to carry the Langford name. Lena's stomach twisted. She had seen stories like this in movies. Rich families tearing people apart because of status, power, reputation. But this wasn't fiction. This was her mother's life. Gave me a choice, Richard continued. Give her up, or lose everything. The words hung heavy between them. He chose her, didn't he? Lena thought. He had to. But the moment she saw the regret in his eyes, she realized the truth was much worse. I fought him. I told him I didn't care about money or business or any of it. But he wasn't just threatening to disown me, Lena. His voice grew cold. He threatened her. Lena's breath hitched. He made it clear, if I didn't end things, Lillian would suffer. He had the power to ruin her life, to take away everything she had. He said she would never be safe. Richard swallowed hard. I had no choice. No choice. Lena could see it now. The young man in love, forced to stand by as his father dictated his future, his happiness. Her mother must have waited for him, must have hoped he would fight for her. And when he never came back, she left. She disappeared from his world, never looking back. And he had searched. I tried to find her. Years later, when I finally broke away from my father's control, she was the first person I looked for. But by the time I got close, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. She was already gone. Lena's breath caught. Her chest ached with the weight of what he was saying. Richard Langford had spent years searching for the woman he loved, never knowing that she had left him with more than just memories. She had left him with a daughter, and in all this time he had never known. Never knew that he had a child, that she had grown up without him, that she had spent every day of her life believing she had no one. Lena's throat tightened. She wasn't just some waitress standing in front of a billionaire. She was his daughter. And this was the moment he had finally found her, without even realizing it. Lena barely made it through the rest of her shift that night. She moved through the motions, refilling coffee cups, clearing plates, scribbling down orders. But her mind was somewhere else entirely. The diner buzzed around her as usual. The same regulars sat in their usual booths. The hum of conversation mixed with the clatter of dishes, the hiss of the coffee machine, the distant tune of an old jukebox playing in the corner. Everything looked the same. But to Lena, nothing felt the same anymore. Her hands trembled as she wiped down the counter. How was she supposed to act normal after tonight? For years, she had told herself she was alone. No parents, no family. Just herself, the streets, and the weight of making it through each day. And yet, with one photograph, one name, everything she thought she knew had unraveled. Richard Langford. Not just a customer, not just a billionaire. A man who had loved her mother. A man who had spent years searching for her, never knowing that he had left behind more than just memories. He had left behind her. She gripped the rag tighter, squeezing her eyes shut. How was she supposed to process this? Why had life played this cruel trick on her? Why did she have to find out this way, through a chance encounter, A faded photograph tucked inside a stranger's wallet? She didn't know whether to feel angry or heartbroken, or both. When her shift finally ended, she was the last to leave. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly above her as she stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin. The street was quiet now, the occasional car passing by, headlights cutting through the night. She exhaled, her breath visible in the chilly air. She had been prepared to walk home alone like she always did. But as soon as she stepped onto the sidewalk, she saw him. Richard Langford stood by the curb, hands in the pockets of his expensive coat. Gone was the poised, confident billionaire who had sat at table 5 earlier that day. Now, standing beneath the flickering streetlight, he looked hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether he had the right to be there. Lena stopped a few feet away, her heart hammering. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I didn't want you to walk home alone." She frowned. "I've been walking home alone my whole life." A muscle in his jaw tensed. That was exactly the problem. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Finally, Richard exhaled. "I know this is a lot." His voice was softer than before, filled with something almost fragile. "But I need you to understand. I didn't abandon you. I never even knew you existed." His voice wavered slightly, the weight of his words pressing between them. "If I had," he swallowed, "I would have never stopped looking." Lena's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But wanting to believe and knowing how to believe were two different things. Her whole life she had been let down. She had learned that people always left, that there was no one coming to save her, that she had no choice but to rely on herself, because in the end, that was all she had. And now, this man, this stranger, wanted to change that? She crossed her arms, her voice quieter now. Why now? She wasn't sure if she was asking him or herself. Why did I have to find out like this? Richard's gaze softened, but there was something haunted in his eyes. "Because the truth has a way of finding us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No matter how long it's been buried." Lena's throat tightened. She hated that his words made sense. She hated that they stirred something in her, something painful, something hopeful. She wanted to run, to pretend this moment never happened, to go back to being the same girl she was yesterday, before she knew the truth. But deep down she knew she couldn't, because no matter how much she wanted to pretend nothing had changed, everything had. And the part of her that had spent years yearning for a family she thought she'd lost forever, that part didn't want to run. It wanted to stay. Lena didn't give him an answer that night. She didn't tell him whether she believed him. She didn't tell him whether she was ready. She just turned and walked away, the cold air stinging her face. Richard didn't stop her. He only watched as she disappeared down the street, his hands clenched into fists, like a man who had spent years losing something and just realized he might have finally found it again, even if he didn't know how to hold on to it. 1 week later, Lena stood outside a towering skyscraper, staring up at the gleaming glass windows that seemed to touch the sky itself. Langford Enterprises. Richard Langford's empire. She had spent the past week trying to forget, trying to convince herself that this wasn't real, that she didn't need him, that she had been fine on her own before, and she could be fine on her own now. But the truth? She wasn't fine. She wasn't okay. Because for the first time in her life, she had something to lose. She didn't know if she was ready to be someone's daughter again. Didn't know if she could let someone in, if she could trust him, this man who had been a stranger just days ago. But maybe. Lena had spent most of her life believing that she was alone in this world. No family, no safety net, just her and the weight of survival pressing down on her shoulders. She had known hunger, the kind that gnawed at her ribs when payday was still days away. She had known exhaustion, from working late shifts, barely sleeping, and waking up only to do it all over again. She had known isolation, standing outside, in the cold, watching families embrace, children laugh, parents fuss, knowing she would never have that again. But now everything was different. She wasn't waking up in her cramped apartment, worrying about how she'd make rent. Instead, she had a place to call home, a real home, not just a temporary stop along the way. She wasn't stretching every dollar, choosing between groceries and bills. Richard made sure of that, not by throwing money at her, but by making sure she never had to struggle the way she had before. He had opened doors for her, offered her opportunities she never even dreamed of. And more than that, she had someone. For the first time in years, she wasn't going through life alone. There was someone who cared about whether she ate, whether she was safe, whether she was happy. Someone who looked at her and saw not just another person getting by, but his daughter. It was overwhelming at times. Some days she still felt like an imposter, like she didn't belong in this new life. But Richard never wavered. He was patient, letting her take her time, never forcing anything. He didn't try to replace what she had lost, but he showed her, in quiet, steady ways, that she didn't have to carry everything on her own anymore. And little by little, the walls she had built started to crack. She caught herself talking to him more, trusting him, leaning on him in ways she never thought she would. She had gone from someone who had no family, who had convinced herself she didn't need one, to someone who had a father. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Maybe she didn't have to be. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't just change everything. It heals everything. Lena's life didn't transform overnight. At first, it felt surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's story, like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. For so long, she had lived paycheck to paycheck, worrying about rent, food, and whether she could make it through another exhausting week. But now she woke up in a place that didn't feel temporary. She had her own room, an entire suite, a space that was hers, with a bed softer than anything she had ever slept on, windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, and a view of the city that made her feel like she was on top of the world. Gone were the days of tiny apartments, flickering lights, and secondhand furniture. She had everything she had once only dreamed of. But the biggest change wasn't the material things. It was opportunity. For the first time, Lena didn't have to worry about putting her dreams on hold because of money. Richard had offered to support her education, not out of pity, but because he genuinely wanted to see her succeed. And after years of scraping by, barely making it through, she finally had the chance to do what she had always wanted: go to college. Stepping onto the campus of one of the most prestigious universities felt like stepping into another world. The towering buildings, the buzzing energy of students, the endless possibilities. It was nothing like the life she had known. Before, school had always been a struggle. Not because she wasn't smart. She had always been a top student, a quiet achiever who buried herself in books, eager to escape into knowledge. But she had never been able to fully focus on her studies when her real concerns were making rent, affording food, and working late shifts just to survive. Now, for the first time, she could breathe. She could take classes without constantly worrying about money. She could actually enjoy learning, explore subjects she loved, and plan for a future she never thought she'd have. But it wasn't just school that changed. Everything about her life was different. She didn't have to take exhausting shifts at the diner anymore. She didn't have to ration her meals, count her coins, or feel the crushing weight of uncertainty every single day. She had security. She had comfort. And most importantly, she had family. Richard wasn't just some distant benefactor. He was her father. And though their relationship wasn't perfect, it was still new, still fragile. He was there. He checked in on her, he asked about her classes, he took her to dinners, introduced her to people, made sure she knew she belonged, not just in his world, but in his life. For so long, Lena had been alone. Now she wasn't. And as she sat in her college dorm, looking out over the city, she realized something. She had spent years believing she was meant to struggle. But maybe, just maybe, she was meant to thrive. This story reminds us that the past has a way of revealing itself when we least expect it. For years, Lena walked through life believing she was alone, believing that the people who were supposed to love and protect her were nothing more than distant memories, ghosts of a life she could never reclaim. She had taught herself not to hope, not to expect anything more than what was right in front of her. Because to hope for something she could never have, that was dangerous. But fate has a way of unraveling even the deepest buried truths. A simple moment, just another shift at the diner, just another customer, became the turning point of her entire existence. One photograph, one name, one revelation that shattered everything she thought she knew. Because sometimes, family isn't just about where you come from. It's about the connections that refuse to be broken, the people who never stop searching, the truths that find their way home, no matter how long it takes. And in the end, it's about what you choose to hold on to. Would Lena have been fine on her own? Maybe. But now, she had a choice. To let the past define her, or to embrace the family she never knew she had. And sometimes, even when life has taught you to stand alone, you don't have to. So ask yourself, what would you do? If you found out your past wasn't what you thought it was, if you discovered a family you never knew existed, would you open your heart to the truth, or would you walk away? Let us know in the comments, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories just like this one, because sometimes the most unexpected moments are the ones that change everything.